So I view HR as two things, culture stewards and engagement catalysts, right? We provide the tools and resources that the entire organization needs to create the workplace that they all want to be a part of. And so I often akin engagement as a cultural attribute, very much like a healthy marriage. Everybody's got to own it. Everybody's got to show up. Some days you show up, you like them. Some days you show up, you don't. Some days it works well. Some days it doesn't. But we've bought in and we've decided that we're going to be engaged. Engagement's a mindset.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Leading Through Listening, the podcast where we dive into real stories of how leaders have transformed their employee experience. We explore topics like innovative strategies for aligning business and human capital priorities, fostering leadership that truly listens, and actionable steps to drive engagement and performance. I'm your host, Sean Fitzpatrick, and today I'm excited to welcome someone who has dedicated her career to helping organizations unlock the potential of their people through robust culture and engagement strategies. Our guest is Ashley Ridgeway-Washington, SVP and CHRO at JPS Health Network. She is a seasoned advisor and executive coach who has worked for Fortune 500 companies, nonprofits, and startups to develop best-in-class people and culture practices. Ashley is known for her ability to balance business and human priorities, showing leaders how engaged employees drive innovation, flexibility, and long-term success. Her unique expertise combines HR, DEI, and legal acumen with deep understanding of organizational performance metrics. Today, we'll explore Ashley's insight on securing executive buy-in for engagement initiatives, translating culture into measurable outcomes, and using metrics to build a compelling business case for prioritizing people strategies. Ashley, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Sean. So great to be here.
Well, Ashley, tell me a little bit about yourself, personally and professionally.
Sure. So I currently serve as a Senior Vice President and Chief Human Resources Officer at JPS Health Network in Fort Worth, Texas. We are Tarrant County's safety net. And so we take care of those patients that can't always get care elsewhere. I will tell you, I am sitting in my purpose in this role, but it took me quite a bit of time to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. So I'm a reformed attorney by trade, grew up in healthcare HR, and then took a stint in tech and realized that I prefer people to widgets. But I often say that my passion and purpose in life sits at the intersection of people and possibility. And so I'm happy to be working in that space and sitting in that purpose here at JPS.
When you started off an attorney, where did that inflection point happen? That's quite a different career path. Though there is alignment with some things around compliance and legal, but that's quite a change. Is there anything in particular that sort of made that change happen for you?
So the reality is I stumbled into my passion. I was an unhappy attorney like many people, took some time off to have a family and did some work as a legal auditor. And quite frankly, the EEO person at the employer I was with walked off the job. The VP of HR came into my office and said, "You're the only barred attorney in the building, and we have a charge of discrimination due tomorrow. Can you help?" And the rest is history.
Interesting. Yeah, sometimes that happens. You just fall into roles and then you realize, boy, I really love this thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's good. One of the things that we do with organizations is try to help, organizations improve business performance, but also create a great place to work for employees. And sometimes they're conflicting, goals. Hopefully they're not, but sometimes they are. So I guess it'd be interesting to hear how you go about helping the executive teams you work with. How do they balance the people priorities and the business priorities? So they're not always thinking short term, because people issues sometimes take longer. Tell me a little bit about how you go about navigating those types of things.
Sure. I think when you start with people at the center, you recognize that whatever it is that you're accomplishing, whatever you're going after, and for us, it's high quality patient care, right? That it is human ingenuity that drives that. And so it is in the best interest of the business to have happy employees. What I would also say is that when you have extended goodwill and done right by employees, when you have kept the things that they need front and center, what you will find is that they are also incredibly willing to reach compromise and go above and beyond. And so we often believe that in order to advance short-term gains, we've kind of got to take a back seat, and we can't always look to the future. But I will tell you, what I have found is that when employees see that there is a mutually beneficial value proposition, and when they recognize that an organization actually cares about them as humans, they will go the distance with you. They will sacrifice, they will make swaps, they will do the things that really allow the business to balance both.
When employees feel that care, that the executive team and the organization really cares about them, are there things that you've seen that either have pointed to that, say, oh, there's a real good example, really like what that executive or leader or manager did, or maybe even ones that sort of, really did the opposite, and they, caused them to sort of, employees go, okay, obviously you guys don't care about, what we think about this organization or our role here.
Sure, we're human. And so I read many years ago The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. And if you've not read that book, I would encourage you to read it, because foundational to a authentic and positive employee experience is understanding that employees need to see companies show up at the moments that matter most to them. They will take less pay, they will do really hard work, but when someone dies or someone is born or something pivotal happens in their life, they need to both feel and see the support of the organization. And so I would say, generally speaking, that really does create truly goodwill. And then I would also say that in this environment, particularly as it relates to Generation Z, our ability to actively listen, to proactively, actively listen and make changes or realign based on employee preference and what we're hearing from employees is really important. I read an article once about Enron, and so the whole journey, the fall of Enron. And there was a researcher that basically went back and looked at a decade of employee engagement surveys and other listening mechanisms. And what they saw in the downfall of Enron is that employees knew it all along, and they were sounding the alarm in many ways. And so it is critical that organizations are actively listening and tuning in to the sentiments of employees, particularly those on the front line, because they are the closest to the work.
Yeah. I guess when you think about, employee engagement and the culture of the organization, how do you get leaders more involved or demonstrating, pick the most senior leadership team? So sometimes, not always, you see them, okay, yes, we're on board. We should be doing, regular feedback, either an annual survey and then pulse surveys in between and different listening mechanisms. But then they send it over to often the human resource group is, okay, there you go. And we've seen some of the most powerful surveys is when the executives are driving it. Yeah, HR is still doing all the heavy lifting in the back end, but they're really driving what they want to learn. They're driving why it's important. They're driving the follow-up. But not all organizations do that. So I'm often wondering, how does HR, how do they see their role in helping, become more positioned as really executive? So if we were asking employees, who's running this survey? Who wants to do it? The executives want to learn about this. That would be the ideal versus, it's a HR initiative. Not that HR is bad, but it, in general, not always has the best, perception. So it's interesting to think about how you would go about doing that.
So I view HR as two things: culture stewards and engagement catalyst, right? We provide the tools and resources that the entire organization needs to create the workplace that they all want to be a part of. And so I often akin engagement as a cultural attribute, very much like a healthy marriage. Everybody's got to own it. Everybody's got to show up. Some days you show up, you like them. Some days you show up, you don't. Some days it works well. Some days it doesn't. But we've bought in and we've decided that we're going to be engaged. Engagement's a mindset. It is behaviors. It is the little things we do in our normal ways of working. It is eye contact. It is leaning into positive intent. It is avoiding assumption. It is being impeccable with our word. And now I'm kind of leaning into my favorite, the 4 agreements. But the bottom line is engagement is something that every single person at an organization must own if it's actually going to be what we want it to be. And then I view that there are some folks who are part of that mix who I call super influencers or super users. And those are executives. They have, kind of the chops and the influence and the authority to be able to really galvanize that. And so we certainly will prepare them with tools. But ultimately, what I found is when, your senior leaders have set the tone and said, this is how we're going to roll, they model that and it continues to permeate throughout the organization.
Yeah, I like that concept you mentioned about engagement being a two-way street, because it's not all about the employees providing feedback. What have you done for me lately? Can you improve this, improve that? Then they're just throwing everything back onto, they're part of the organization. Everyone's part of the organization. So if you can sort of make it part of it's owned by you, part of it's owned by your manager, part of it's owned by leadership, it's not all, one team or one group driving it. So I like that perception. And I think it's a really good way to think about it.
So, Sean, I have to say this. I do a lot of focus grouping and I have committed agreements. So, like team commitments that we have as we're having this space together. And I often say, when you come to this space, just know I'm not a vending machine and I'm not Santa Claus. Like, you can't sit on the organization's lap and lay out a wish list and have no accountability. You can't put a quarter in and get a bag of chips out. You don't put thoughts in and get engagement out. This is a journey that we all take together.
Interesting. Yeah. It sort of reminds me. So sometimes we get invited in to do some of those also. And when you go through the process and you have them, clarify what you're meaning on this feedback. And then, how would you go about solving it? And then you ask, what are the steps this team could take, or people at your, all of a sudden you hear for a while, you got crickets. All of a sudden it's like, oh, you want us to do something? But then you get over that hope or obstacle. And then you get to see some people realize, yeah, maybe this is not just a venting session. It's a dialogue, and it's an opportunity for them to provide feedback and get feedback and also take accountability for some of the roles. So yeah, I like your, I'm not Santa Claus. I'm going to have to steal that from you. I'm going to use that probably from time to time. And I'm not a vending machine. You can't just put nickels in or quarters in and get something out. That's good. You've worked for a wide variety of organizations, and whenever you're working with executives, how do you get them to sort of pay attention to engagement initiatives or feedback or alignment if they're not on board, or, we ran a survey 3 years ago and it didn't work, or, sometimes I even hear, CEO, I don't believe in surveys. They're not effective or they're not useful. Do you ever run across anything like that? And if you have, how have you gone about sort of changing their perception? If you have changed your perception, how have you gone about approaching that?
So data doesn't lie. There is a real hard cost. We often think about engagement as soft, mushy stuff, but it is absolutely hard in many ways. And I will tell you, for the first time in modern healthcare, labor costs are the difference between profitability and loss. And so as I speak to leaders within my own organization, even beyond that, I do a fair amount of coaching. I will share the data. I will ask them to provide me the data, and let's look through it. Let's look at the cost of turnover. Let's look at your vacancy rate. How long have these critical roles been open, and who's doing that job, and are they doing it well? Look at your cost of voluntary turnover in 1 year. These are people who negotiated to be with you, left a job that they were at. They negotiated the salary they wanted. So it's not that, right? It's something else, right? And so often I will lean into data to help executives understand the cost associated with poor engagement. And then when you get past that, you really start to talk about the value proposition associated with a culture that feels like we're all in this together. And so we start with the data, and then we kind of come back around to the heart. And what we basically talk a lot about is, when you don't have an engaged staff, you are leaving money and innovation on the table. And who wants to do that? Like, if you had data that told you could be 30% more productive if you just treated people with basic dignity and integrity at work, who would walk away from that?
You would think, yeah, it would be very, it's a fairly low cost. It takes time and behavioral change, but it is not a big capital investment to change over time. You brought up an interesting concept around, the cost of turnover or voluntary turnover. Do executives have a clear picture or a pretty good sense of what the actual cost is? I know it does vary based on the type of role and how easy are they to find or it's getting harder now with lower and lower people in with unemployment being such as it is, where there's still lots of opportunity, particularly in healthcare. It's one of the fastest growing sectors out there. But would they be able to say, okay, for a $75,000 a year professional you have there, would they know how much it probably costs to replace them, both the hard and soft costs? Would they have that clear in their mind?
So I would say probably not, but that's why strategic HR is so important, because your business partner should be bringing that to the table as a part of the standard business review. The days of personnel are over. I mean, that is not the value proposition of strategic human capital these days. Our job is to be managing labor and costs at the P&L level. And so part of that review is looking at the employee, what I call engagement health, and talking about these are the number of dollars that we, lost. And, I've gotten a lot of feedback recently from colleagues, other CHROs. We talk a lot about talking about turnover in terms of just full-time employees or just, first year. But ultimately, anyone who leaves your organization and causes a disruption in business continuity costs you dollars. Now, some of that's positive. We want some of those folks that are not working we want to promote them to patient, right?
Self-select. Yeah,
yes,
self-select out of here.
yes.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we should be lifting those costs up to the business and helping to educate on how we mitigate those costs and create a culture we can all be proud of.
I've often heard and seen it, and it varies, but for a sort of a professional, maybe not an executive and not sort of a manual, maybe early in their careers, but like somewhere 1.5 times their salary. Is that, and I know it's hard to generalize, but how do you think about those numbers?
Sure. So there are a lot of calculations out there. Because I'm in healthcare, I tend to lean into most of mine are clinical roles to NSI, which really gives some best in practice. And so what it says on average to replace a bedside nurse is about 60 grand, right? That doesn't include the opportunity costs associated with those people working on that. It doesn't include executive search or any kind of search you might do. It also doesn't include the cost of temporary or vacancy to fill that role when someone leaves. So when you start to look at that, you're talking about probably all in $100,000.
Just to replace, for a lot. So it starts to add up pretty quickly.
It does. It does.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, do you track in your organization? Do you track involuntary leaves, regrettable loss, like all of those sort of core metrics? Because they all are somewhat different. You're right. They all impact the organization because someone left, but they can impact it in different ways. And sometimes even on top of that, strategic roles, people are either really hard to find or replace versus less strategic at the time, and strategy and direction changes. How do you go about thinking of all of those metrics or tracking all of those? Do you guys typically do all that in your organization?
We do. We have HR analytics dashboard, my Bible. I look at it probably every other day, sometimes every day, depending on what's going on. And from my perspective, I believe that data is a part of the story. Data is really important, but it also helps us to give context around what else is going on. And so I tend to pull together, both for the HR committee of the board as well as my senior leadership team, kind of a quarterly kind of overview of where we are from an employee engagement or employee health standpoint to talk about what information is giving me indications that we need to attend to a certain thing or that we need to lean in a place. And so everything from exit interview data to, one of the things we do is our CEO breakfast, which our new employees really like, about their 60th day. New employees get to come in, white tablecloth, hot breakfast, and they get to converse with each other and executives. At the end of that, we ask some questions about their onboarding experience and whether they feel like they have a best friend at work and they've, gotten sticky. Right? And so all of that information together helps me to piece together kind of what the sentiment of our teams are and where we need to deploy additional support resources or rethink an approach.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Well, they say the first couple of months of a new employee are critical. Because, you're either going to get them connected to the organization, both socially and in their job. And if you do a good job there, it really can keep people longer and be more engaged throughout their career.
You have 45 to 60 days. In the first 45 to 60 days, an employee has already decided whether they're going to stay with you in year one. If they are disengaged by day 30, they are already looking for a job. And in healthcare, a bad nurse can go somewhere tomorrow. So the reality is it's so important to create that stickiness to make people feel welcome and like they have wayfinders and buddies and support that just help them as humans be grounded in that space so that they can then start to learn the landscape of the work.
Yeah, because they made a big decision in terms of changing and joining this. So you want to make sure that, you made the right decision. And because there's this concept, in buying, on the markets, that like cognitive dissonance. It's like, okay, did I make it? Did I do the right thing? You're nervous going in. So the more you can do, I think, up front, it pays off handsomely. And you've probably seen that in the work you've done.
Absolutely. And you'd be surprised just how little stuff check in with somebody, send them a note, send them a recognition, via email. Stop, peek your head around in their workspace and ask them if they've had lunch or bring them a packet of M&Ms. I mean, things that are virtually free really do make the difference in their first kind of 90-day experience.
Yeah, those little things. It's not so much the gift or the M&Ms, or it's the concept that, oh, people recognize me. They see me. I'm part of the team now. And it's that whole area of just feeling like you're involved in the organization early on. And that seems to make a big difference. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit about what's your measurement strategy there? How do you go about measuring? And then, if you talked about when you work with the board and the HR committee, they probably look for, okay, how's the culture there? How's engagement? How do you go about pulling this? Do you have annual surveys, pulses? Do you do, focus groups where you collect data and summarize it? How do you go about, what are the measurements that you guys use on a regular basis? And what do you find most effective?
So our primary listening mechanisms are Gallup. We're a Gallup survey, employee survey.
Hence the best friend at work question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we do Gallup annually, and then we do a pulse. We actually listen to every employee, so part-time PRN, full-time, as well as our clinicians. Last year, we had 95% engagement in the employee and 84% engagement with clinicians, which is unheard of. 75% of our part-time and PRN share their voice with us. So those are our two primary ways. But in the interim, we do a lot of other stuff. We work a lot with our leaders. And so one of the really cool things that we did a couple of years ago, and this predates me, so I can't take credit for this, we've just enhanced it, is we've anchored all of our leadership development courses to our Q12, which are the questions that we ask and our indicators of engagement. So every time we teach a new leader any new skill, we ensure that we've infused those Q12 behavioral attributes and ways of working into their training. And what has happened is we've created an engagement flywheel. So leaders are incorporating that into their agendas. They're listening as a part of their team meetings. They're listening as a part of rounding and bedside shift report and stoplighting. And so although we have these big listening mechanisms, we are listening all along at the department level, which is where I think the magic is actually occurring. And then beyond that, we have focus grouping and specific strategies for new employees. We've also started the process in this year of isolating, where we start to see people, kind of cliff, that 3 to 5 year mark in healthcare, and how we can start to get into some stay conversations and stay interviews. And so we have, two big bangs, but we have infused active listening into every kind of facet of our employee touches so that we can keep a pulse on where employees are expressing concerns and rounding and being able to do some service recovery real time.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. It sounds like, you've got a lot of good core metrics. What I really like is how you're infusing some of those into that management training, management development. So it becomes part of their way of thinking on how, the culture, really. If you're building that into their thinking, you're building that into the culture, because they represent often an important part of the culture and what it's sort of like to be working around here. So I really like that. That's good. That's powerful. When you're in an organization for a long time, or you've seen it over time, sometimes it takes a while for some of these things initiatives you learn things maybe on feedback or from employees, then you implement them, or they inform decisions that you guys are working towards. Are there some examples that you can point to where some of the initiatives have had great or good long-term business impact? So, you've adjusted this culture, and now we've seen changes out 6 months, 9 months, 18 months, 2 years, because sometimes it takes a while for this stuff to show up.
Sure. So I'll go back to my Christus Health days. That's where I grew up in HR. And I think about when I first came there, I was, 30-something-year-old leader, and very, in many respects, idealistic and altruistic. But I had this crazy idea. And I went to my senior leadership team and I said, I'm looking at this engagement data, and every year the same people are struggling. And everybody knows it. We can name them off the top of our head, but nobody's doing anything with them. There's no accountability. And can I submit a proposal that changes that? Can we hold them accountable? Can we actually talk about whether these people should be leading people here? And my leaders trusted me to build something. And it was a couple of things. It was a tiering, for lack of a better word. So we had those folks who were superstars. We had those people in the middle, had people who were really struggling. But it wasn't just calling out who was great and who wasn't. It was really working with strategic business partners as well as talent management to cultivate some action planning that was really comprehensive and was both at the team level and with the leader. But the other thing that we did was we celebrated those at the top of the organization like crazy. So we printed Superman capes and we did the Yeti cups, and it said tier 1 leader for that year on them. And I will tell you, 4 years later, when we got ready to make the decision that after, your third year, you would be invited to step away from the organization in a leadership capacity if you couldn't improve your scores. What I can tell you is this. I believe there were less than 3 people across the organization of 50,000 people who were invited to do something different. Those who no longer wanted to be engaged, most of them self-selected out. We found that at the end of the day, many people wanted to be better. They didn't have the tools. And so we saw a tremendous increase in those folks migrating from the bottom quartiles up even to the top quartile. And I will tell you, that cup every year was, like a bonus. If you didn't have your cup, it became a cultural thing. Leaders would say, I don't want tier 1, tier 2 leaders or tier 3 leaders on my team. So it became this thing. It was this friendly competition that really built the muscle of engagement, and it helped leaders to buy in. And 4 years later, tier 1 leadership was just the way to be. It was part of the question around whether you got stretch assignments or you got it became foundational. Not doing good work was no longer good enough. You had to do good work and engage your team, and you had to own engagement. And that became the prototype for our leadership.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. And I like the example of the cups. It's like a symbol, right?
It is.
If you go, there's some research that's out there, like, what's culture like in an organization? Well, it's based on some underlying assumptions we have. And those assumptions then get representative values. And then those values you see them as symbols often in the organization. And like symbols could be plaques on the wall, it could be, but in this case, they're cups. And people, they tie into that, and it represents the culture and part of the culture in many ways. So I really like that. That's interesting. We work with a lot of, what we call small to mid-sized organizations, 150, 250, 300, 500 person organizations. And maybe they're just starting out on their journey on trying to understand employee engagement, get leadership buy-in. Maybe they haven't done systematic surveys on a regular basis, and they really haven't got a listening program. What do you suggest for them? How would they go about getting started? Or what are the things they might want to look at if you sort of would think of a couple of things so they can build some momentum?
So I would say I have 3 pieces of advice. First, if you're a relatively new company, build it in and don't try to bolt it on. What we know about any cultural attribute is when it is infused in ways of working, it works. Trying to layer inclusion on top, trying to layer engagement on top never works. It has to be the way you work. Secondarily, I would say start asking the tough questions of yourself and of the organization, and actually, even if you don't have an engagement survey, and I will tell you now, there are a lot of really good inexpensive tools out there. So find one to start to gather sentiments and identify what the strategy will be to listen, share feedback, and start a 2-way dialogue. And then the third thing that I would say is something that I started saying, a member of my team started saying it, and it stuck. Good, better, best. Never let it rest until your good is better and your better is best. Keep pressing forward. You are really pursuing progress and not perfection. So continue to move forward. Measure your success, celebrate your success, recalibrate, and go back at it. Because engagement is a journey. It is not something that happens overnight. It's kind of gradually, suddenly, all at once, and then it's super fragile. One thing can throw it off. And so just keep it top of mind and keep moving forward toward it.
Well, Ashley, that's great. And so some of the things I pulled away from here is how you see, first of all, engagement as a 2-way street, right? It's not just all about, hey, what am I going to do for you today or tomorrow? It's what are you also going to do to help, engage yourself or engage sort of in the work that's being done in the organization. And your tip around, build it in. You gave it right at the end, but you gave a really good example early on in what you do in your organization on how you build some of those metrics that you ask in the survey into your leadership training and competency development and capability development. Those 2 points in themselves are fantastic. And then the last point, and I think I agree with you, is, just start. So the good, better, best, just start somewhere, get going on it, because it is a journey. It's not a sprint. You don't have to be perfect right out of the gates, but if you're committed to it and you're building it into your business, it will happen over time, and you'll learn more about how to build a better workplace that's great for the employees and also, good business at the same time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great. I appreciate you.
Thanks for joining us today on Leading Through Listening. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube Music so you don't miss a future episode. We'll see you again soon.